Deep in the wild Texas coast, Spanish soldiers cut through dense brush. Rumors spoke of a hidden French colony, but what they found was worse than any warning could prepare them for. There was no cheer of settlers, no smoke from chimneys, only shattered wood, twisted and blackened by fire. Rusted cannons lay in the mud, muskets scattered like the bones of forgotten men. Silence. Absolute silence. Yet something lingered in the air. Fear, betrayal, death. This was Fort St. Louis, a colony meant to anchor France on the Gulf of Mexico. Within 4 short years, it would be swallowed by storms, torn apart by mutiny, and left in ruins by massacre, leaving behind only whispers and questions that still haunt this land today. Hidden America presents Fort St. Louis, the colony that never stood a chance. In the late 17th century, Europe was a chessboard of empires, each hungry for control of the New World. France dreamed of a colony that would dominate the Gulf of Mexico, a foothold to challenge Spain's vast territories. At the center of this plan was René-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, a man obsessed with empire and glory. In 1684, he set sail from France with 4 ships, hundreds of men, and a vision of a French kingdom stretching across the continent. Storms battered the fleet, wrecking ships and scattering crews. Navigational errors sent them far off course, and supply shortages began almost immediately. Yet La Salle pressed on, convinced that the Mississippi River and his destiny awaited. Behind him, whispers of doubt and fear grew among the men. Morale faltered, supplies dwindled, and as the coast of modern Texas came into view, the line between ambition and disaster had already begun to blur. This was not a colony built on safety. Every step, every decision brought the men closer to starvation, conflict, and the violent collapse that would define their short-lived dream. Fort St. Louis would be a monument to courage and folly, a story of ambition swallowed by the merciless forces of nature and by human betrayal. In 1685, after months of storms, shipwrecks, and bitter loss, La Salle's battered expedition finally sighted the coast of Texas. It was not the Mississippi they had sought, but an uncharted wilderness, vast, desolate, and unforgiving. With 1 ship already lost and supplies running thin, the exhausted colonists had no choice but to land. They came ashore near Matagorda Bay, a place of shifting tides and treacherous sandbars. The ship struggled in the shallow waters, and another vessel soon ran aground, splintered by the surf. Precious cargo, tools, weapons, food was swallowed by the sea. Each wreck cut deeper into the colony's survival, leaving them stranded with less and less hope. On land, the reality was harsher still. The Texas wilderness was nothing like the fertile promise La Salle had envisioned. Dense forest pressed against marshes buzzing with insects. Game was scarce, water unreliable, and the terrain a constant enemy. Tension spread among the colonists as hunger set in. The dream of empire was crumbling into a fight for bare survival. Yet La Salle refused to retreat. He ordered the building of a settlement, a fragile outpost he called Fort St. Louis. Surrounded by dangers both seen and unseen, this isolated colony would soon descend into violence, desperation, and horror. The French flag had been planted in Texas soil, but it flew over a land already cursed with doom. Fort St. Louis was more than a settlement. It was a crucible of human endurance. Disease spread quickly through the cramped, poorly constructed shelters. Dysentery, scurvy, and fevers claimed lives almost daily. Food was scarce, hunting yielded little, and supplies from France were nowhere in sight. Starvation loomed like a silent predator over every tent and timbered wall. Tensions among the colonists grew with each passing week. Soldiers questioned La Salle's leadership, settlers whispered of mutiny, and even priests despaired at the relentless suffering. Trust eroded under the strain of hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Arguments turned into fights, and fear hardened into suspicion. Every shadow in the dense Texas forest seemed to hide an enemy, every gust of wind a harbinger of disaster. Survival demanded more than courage. It required cunning, endurance, and a willingness to confront the unknown at every turn. Yet even these qualities could not protect them from the storm of human failings that would soon tear the colony apart. Fort St. Louis had become a fragile island of humanity in a wilderness that refused mercy. By 1687, the fragile threads holding Fort St. Louis together had begun to unravel. Starvation and disease had already claimed too many lives, and distrust now festered like a hidden wound. The men whispered about La Salle's failures, blaming him for the endless hardships and lost ships. Mutiny was no longer a threat. It was an inevitability. La Salle himself, once the symbol of French ambition, became a target. As he led a small party inland to search for the Mississippi, his own men turned on him. In the wilderness, far from the safety of the fort, he was brutally murdered, a victim of betrayal that foreshadowed the colony's doom. Back at the fort, the survivors faced a relentless assault from the Karankawa, a local native group defending their land. The French, weakened by disease and malnutrition, could not withstand the attack. Houses were burned, weapons broken, and lives extinguished in a violent storm of blood and fire. Only a handful of children survived, captured and later rescued by the Spanish. In just 4 short years, the dream of a French empire on the Gulf Coast had turned into a nightmare. Fort St. Louis, once a beacon of ambition, became a silent ruin, a grim testament to human frailty and the merciless forces of nature and man alike. In 1689, 2 years after La Salle's death, a Spanish expedition pushed into the wilderness of coastal Texas. For months, rumors had spread through New Spain of a French outpost hidden somewhere along the Gulf, an enemy foothold in Spanish territory. Determined to find it, Captain Alonso de León led his men through tangled forests and treacherous marshes until, at last, they reached the ghostly remains of Fort St. Louis. What they found was not a colony, but a graveyard. The wooden structures lay in ruins, scorched and broken. Scattered bones, men, women, and children spoke of the horror that had unfolded. Rusted cannons pointed at nothing, their purpose long extinguished. And in the silence, only the wind through the grass seemed to whisper the story of betrayal, starvation, and slaughter. Among the wreckage, the Spanish discovered survivors, children who had been taken captive by the Karankawa. Through them, the tale of the colony's collapse began to surface. Of mutiny, of La Salle's murder, of the bloody attack that erased Fort St. Louis from the map. For Spain, the ruins were a warning and an opportunity. They swiftly claimed the site, erasing the last traces of France's ill-fated dream. Yet the bones of Fort St. Louis remained a haunting reminder. Ambition and empire had met their end here, on the lonely shores of Texas. Fort St. Louis did not survive, but its story did, carried in whispers, maps, and the scars it left on the Texas coast. For centuries, historians, explorers, and archaeologists have sought to uncover its secrets. The full story remains shrouded in mystery. Who survived? How did the Karankawa interact with the last colonists? And what if other undiscovered remnants of the colony still lie buried beneath the soil? France's dream on the Gulf Coast failed, but the echoes of that failure shaped future settlements, missions, and the map of early America. Today, the story of Fort St. Louis lives in history books, archaeological digs, and in the imagination of those drawn to the unknown. Fort St. Louis is gone, but its ghost still haunts the Texas coast, a silent witness to ambition, betrayal, and the unforgiving wilderness.